centered on God. Now, I said this before. Walls, they weren't any great feats of engineering or construction. In fact, you would not see this on the History Channel of Modern Marvels, if any of you watched that. Probably wouldn't have showed up on the History Channel. But there is something I want you to notice, and it's in verse 16. When all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence. For they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Think about that for a moment. Jerusalem has been surrounded by enemies. We've seen this throughout our reading. These people were threatened. They despised the Jews. Nehemiah had to constantly face opposition. And by the way, the church too faces opposition in our world today. It is getting more aggressive, more hostile all the time. But I want to show you what this there's a tremendous reversal of affairs. At this point in the book, all of the enemies were afraid. In fact, let me read it to you from that translation called The Message by Eugene Peterson. This verse says, when all our enemies heard the news and all the surrounding nations saw it, our enemies totally lost their nerve. I like that. They had totally lost their nerve. In other words, their bubble burst. They've fallen greatly in their pride. Nehemiah's critics, who had hounded him so mercilessly, lost their courage. And we see this today, don't we? World leaders who vent their own power and stick out their own chests and say how mighty we are, only to be humbled, only to be brought low. And what you're seeing here is something that Nehemiah wants us to see in his journal, and that is that God had done this. See that? That God had done this. And what's amazing about this is that the enemies saw that God had done this. It's one thing for you and I, who are born-again followers of Jesus Christ, to recognize that God is doing something in our midst. It is another thing when non-Christians and those who aren't following Jesus recognize that God is doing something. Now that's amazing. That's amazing. And I got to tell you that sometimes people may not even become Christians. They may not embrace faith. They may not be attached to His Word, but they will take note when God is doing something in their midst. And I just love what Nehemiah does here, because Nehemiah really could have said, oh guys, 141 years, that wall has been down, and I built it in 52 days. He could have done that. And after those 52 days, he could be giving seminars on how to rebuild walls in 52 days. He could be writing books on aggressive leadership. He could be on the speaking tour, the circuit out there, telling everybody, this is how it's done. He didn't, did he? He said, this is what God's done. You see what leadership is about? It's centered on God. Leaders say, this is not about me. This is about you, God. This is about what you're doing in our midst. We don't take credit for whatever good is. It is what God is doing. God gets the glory, not me. And as I've read this book, and I've preached to you, and I've shared with you, it's just occurred to me over and over again how God-shaped and God-centered Nehemiah's life was. I mean, he was just infused with God. His life, his ministry, shaped by God. And I think that's a great thing for all of us to sort of step back and evaluate our own lives. Is my life centered on God? Or is it just something I say, but deep down inside, I hope I get the glory. I hope that when people look at me someday, they're going to say, wow, what a great guy he was. And you know what? We're all tempted to do that. We are all tempted to do that. I pray that we are God-centered as His people. Number three.